Welcome to Below the Line, where we talk about working in Hollywood from the crew perspective. My name is Skid. I'm a former assistant director and your host. As regular listeners are probably aware, the podcast took an unexpected hiatus because I was working on a movie for the last few months and didn't have time to do both. Specifically, I was hired as a health and safety manager for a Netflix film called Red Notice that was filming in Atlanta, and I came on board to implement their COVID protocols. My guests today have also been working in this space. First, Jill Maxcy. Jill, you're a DGA First Assistant Director who also serves on the AD/UPM Council at the Directors Guild, and you're currently working as a COVID compliance supervisor during the pandemic. Welcome to Below the Line.
Thank you.
We're also joined today by Kaston Smalley, who has been working as a health and safety officer as well. Greg is a native of Texas and has lived in New York City for 3.5 years, pursuing his acting career. He is also an acute care nurse practitioner with a background in ICU, cath lab, surgery, internal medicine, and urgent care. Greg, welcome.
Thank you.
All right, so no spoilers today for specific shows, but we are going to dive into the protocols that are enabling filming to resume. Let's start by talking about the development of these protocols. By mid-March, production across the board has essentially come to a halt. What were each of you doing at that time?
Hiding in my house.
I was working. When the shutdown actually happened, I was, we were in the midst of, pilot season here, what we call it in New York, and everything shut down, and I kind of went back into the hospital full time and took a frontline assignment as they deployed nurses from all over the country here. And for 41 days straight, I was in a hotel being bused to hard hit locations and treating COVID patients. That's what I was doing.
That's great.
I was hiding too.
Yeah.
Jill, were you working when things started to close?
No, I was on a NBC job, Council of Dads, in February, right when COVID started kind of approaching. And I was learning a lot about Wuhan and studying what was happening there as just a parent and a human being, just watching the hospitals being built. And I had just watched the Bill Gates pandemic documentary on Netflix, I think. And I was getting interested in it because we were planning on shutting down, but then we finished and then we went our ways.
Now, nobody really knew how long it was going to be or what the issues were, but obviously the writing was on the wall that this was going to be more serious than the couple of weeks break that many of us thought when it first started. By the time June rolls around, some productions are filming what they can under quarantine conditions, but also the unions are getting together and figuring out how to do this safely. And that's when they put out the Safe Way Forward, based on medical expertise about what conditions might make filming possible going forward. And things are starting to come together. What were your guys' thoughts when that happened?
Tell you, I was on the AD/UPM Council. I heard a lot about the papers coming forward. I wasn't involved in the papers, but I in the meetings we were discussing them and how the unions were involved. The testing scenarios that they were placing forward were very challenging because they weren't in place at all, the testing ability at that time in Hollywood. So when the requirements came out, we had to do safety plans for the unions, and those had to be approved. And then they had to make sure that the testing plans were in place, and then getting the testing facilities to come out to your location to shoot in July was very sketchy.
Yeah, and I was at that point, I had left the hospitals and went to testing. We were doing testing, remote testing and education basically at that point in June. And I was speaking back and forth with my manager at the time. And things were just kind of uncertain. No auditions were coming through, of course. And so we were just kind of holding. So I wasn't much aware of what they were doing at that time. I was mainly focused on what we were doing with testing ourselves here in New York.
And so, Greg, let me follow up with you then. How did you end up working again on film or television?
Well, in July, my manager actually passed away. And I'm at the beginning of my career here, and you're at that crossroad situation where it's precarious what's going on in the industry. You really don't, you kind of feel like you're left on the street. You're like, where do I go? What do I do? And I had another actress friend of mine who's she's an RN, and she had started working with this company doing COVID compliance. And the thing that it was basically both of our passions meeting for the first time. And mainly I've spent my last part of my career working as a healthcare provider in the operating room. And infection control and viruses, bacteria, all that type of things are second nature to us because if we deal with it every day. And so, and she's an OR nurse as well. And so we just kind of, she was doing it and I went ahead and I was like, okay, well, let's give this a try. And so I kind of got into it that way. I had an interview and just full speed ahead.
Now, Jill, you have been working in this space as well. And in fact, you have a website and have brought together several resources helping productions navigate this space. Can you tell me a little more about that?
Sure. In July, I started working on commercials with a company in Los Angeles called Saniset. They were doing PPE and beginning the testing. And at that time, I decided that I should form a company because there was nobody out there in Los Angeles who was able to train other people to do this position. I received some training for COVID compliance out of the UK. It was very beginning, very just rudimentary. And so I formed a company called COVID-19 Compliance Services. And I began to train other assistant directors because I felt like the ADs were right in line with, they didn't have medical knowledge, but if we could hire an epidemiologist to advise us, we could manage the crew. And then I wound up coordinating with Emily Gurley, and she's the epidemiologist with Johns Hopkins University who does the contact tracing course through them. She became my consultant, and she looked at my safety plans and guided me on what to do on set and everything. And so I now have about 20, 30 people that I farm out to different jobs currently.
For myself, the way things developed, just while we're doing origin stories, is that when the pandemic hit and things started to shut down, again, regular listeners will know the podcast pivoted quite a bit to cover these issues and how they were affecting the industry in real time. And so I started paying attention and staying in close contact with folks who are working in this space. And then somewhat coincidentally, when they started talking about the challenges of coming back together, I threw my name out there just as something I could possibly consider doing. Some old folks that I had worked with in the past wanted someone to come on board for Red Notice on Netflix. And I happen to know a bunch of people involved. And so since my regular consulting work was drying up with the economic downturn as well, like as many of you guys have alluded, there just wasn't a lot of work going on. I was available. And so they brought me in, did some planning for about a month virtually before going down to Atlanta to join with the actual setup. What I think was unique, I won't say unique, but where my movie was in an interesting place was that they were halfway done before the shutdown. And now it was an idea, well, how do we get the other half done to follow up on our investment? And so they had the wherewithal and the interest in investing further, basically to see that things to get done. But I think where this leads to is at this time, yes, there's guidance out there. The Safe Way Forward had come out, but the production studios are still deciding for themselves how they're going to implement this on the ground. They're designing their own systems, how it's going to work here and there. And I think as I've asked around, and it's probably apparent to you guys as well, there were a lot of differences in how this was being done. Did you guys have similar experiences during this June to July, August timeframe with production starting to start back up?
For me, it was my experience when I actually started on, it was probably at the end of July and right at the beginning of August. There were a lot of the show. I think the biggest issue or concern was that my show was just beginning. We hadn't even, they had actually they did start like months before. I think it was even the year before, probably planning things out, but nothing had actually shot. And so now it's whereas you have this budget that's already allotted for everything else, and then you have this new thing coming along that has to go on top of this, which is COVID related. And so the biggest thing, the challenge was of knowing everything that I needed going into this, and I knew the staff that I needed, and trying to, let the production know this is what I need, and them not really understanding and trying to take baby steps into doing those things. And it's like, well, we're 4 weeks in, and now you've given me half of the things I said I needed because you realize that I do. And that was just, and then you move on further, and then you finally have everything you need. And it's been such, a struggle of trying to, bring together these two entities of, healthcare and infection control into production, which those two were, they really weren't ever coinciding in the sense that they were today. And so it was, it was, for me, that was my experience with trying to get things going again, was explaining to productions why we need things and why it's important, and then comparing to other things that were going on. Whereas here in New York, it's different to put on a show here in New York versus putting in one in LA, because mostly in LA, I've lived in LA, and everybody, there's cars, you can get places. Where in New York, public transportation is really important, and it is, it's the means of transportation for a lot of people, and it's much more expensive to do things. And, it is New York as well. So it's kind of my experience of getting into it.
Well, Jill, how about for you? You mentioned working on commercials in the beginning. What was it like starting out in this space?
When I started out on commercials in July, there was no testing going on. We didn't have testing in place. So basically it was, I did a commercial for a university, and I worked with the first assistant director to make sure that we had proper ventilation in the room, that we were working with windows open. The sound department had to kind of like deal with the sound of the wind of the windows being open. So what we would do is we would roll for about 15 minutes based on what my epidemiologist told me. And then we would take everybody out of the room, put the mask back on, and then we'd go in and sanitize. And then we would put a fan in and kind of push the air outside the windows. And then the second commercial I had, I won't even tell you what it was, but we had a tester show up with rapid test kits in the back of his trunk, and he had no PPE on. He had just a surgical mask with an N95 underneath, and then he went into a trailer, and then they're like, "Oh, in 15 minutes we're going to have the results." And the 15 minutes was the first person we tested, and then we had to like go a minute after that, and he didn't even have a face shield on. It was wonky, and I was just like, that is it. I'm never doing this again. And after that, we didn't do it that way. We had a PCR test that we sent people to, clinics, and we never did anything out of a car. In fact, that guy the second day called me up and said, "Jill, I've tested positive for COVID. I can't conduct the testing for your crew today."
Oh, man.
So I'm like, what the beep? And I'm like, okay, we're putting everybody to the nearest clinic, and we scramble. We got them into an urgent care, which is not even good either, because you could potentially have COVID patients waiting in the waiting room. So we don't do that anymore. But that's what it was like in July.
It was definitely Wild West, where I think even when I went on Netflix, now Netflix had all the money in the world. So we had lots of testing. We had lots of people to hire. We were starting out with just the construction folks and sort of getting our system in place. And we had bought out a lot there in Atlanta where we were the only folks on the grounds, but learning all the protocols and how do we control that, we had to make up from scratch. That being said, though, we had the resources to be able to pursue it. But even then, when I first went on, they were saying, "Oh, there's just going to be a couple of shows start up. We're going to see how it goes." But very quickly, I think the competition to start up made people start to really push forward. And I think studios across the board, not that everything went back online, but people were really, really getting out ahead of themselves, I think, as far as the number of folks that wanted to film all at once. And I got very busy very fast. Jill, did you see that kind of growth with your company as far as people coming to you?
I got really busy in August. I had to hire a couple people to help me. And the one thing that I was doing in August was the safety planning for commercials. Commercials were the only thing in Los Angeles that were going. There were very little TV shows. But I was slammed getting either officers for commercials or doing the safety plan. And the safety plan would take me 2 to 3 days to compile based on everything. Then the union would look at it and they would come back with questions. SAG would come back with asking the ventilation plan. At that time, I did a planning for a movie, No Man of God, shooting in Pomona, which is about 45 minutes outside of Los Angeles. And we did that. And then all of a sudden I started hearing about SAG stacking up projects where they were, needed 4 or 5 weeks to get the plan in. And then they had to like schedule the ventilation planning meeting. So it was pretty jamming there for a while.
Greg, you said you started a project in July, and did that then continue for a while, or were you bouncing around?
So I tagged on to a project at the end of July, and I left that project and went on to the new project, which was just starting up. I was had previously started before and had shut down, and here we are again, and they hadn't filmed anything. But also what I did was I ended up having to push them back 2 weeks because a lot of these shows were wanting to start, okay, well, you come in this weekend, we're going to start bringing in crew and start pre-pro next week. I was like, no, like there's no way. And, Grant, I had to push them back 2 weeks because it's like, I want to be in a position to succeed. And that was also one of the struggles, that it's not, life as usual. You can't, a lot of stuff in production is, is last minute and stuff, and you just can't do that anymore. You just cannot, make those decisions, on the sole basis of what you were doing a year ago.
Yeah, that's a good segue maybe into talking about some of the specific protocols. So testing is a big one, right? One, in the beginning, there wasn't enough testing to go around, and it took time to ramp that up. But then two, testing itself, if you test me today, you basically, at your best case scenario, know whether I got COVID 3 days ago. You don't know whether I was exposed yesterday or the day before, because you just aren't as sensitive by that point. And I think that's a challenge for film folks, right? It's not just you can, test and then suddenly you allow these people onto set, because you don't know. You could be carrying it unknowingly, given the nature of this disease.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that, because there's so many different scenarios and ideas and these protocols that it's like I tell people, you can go to 3 different cardiologists and they'll tell you 3 different things, and they'll tell you why the other cardiologists are wrong as well. That's, the whole 14-day quarantine versus the 10-day isolation, with how those things changed. The virus takes anywhere from 2 to 14 days to, can incubate for 2 to 14 days. And you get on a plane and you get here, you leave on Monday, you get here on Monday, and we test you on Tuesday. We still may not know if you got anything on the plane. So this is the other thing, a lot of productions want to get these waivers for these people. I'm like, well, you are increasing the risk. And they're still doing it. There are a lot of shows that are still trying to get waivers for actors that are coming in from these places that, are on the travel advisory list. Luckily right now, California is off. So, when they were on, there was a little bit more people were trying to like, oh, well, let's get them in. And I was very black and white when it came to some of these protocols. There were a few things that were a hard stop. For me, it was, okay, this is the safest way to do this. And they were like, okay, well, we need this. Okay, well, this is my recommendation. So let's try to do what you want to do the safest way possible, finding some middle ground. And that's what I found myself doing most of the time. But I never gave in to where I was putting people totally at risk for, just to accommodate what the studio needed all the time, because that's just not what I'm here for.
So the show I'm working on now is a feature film, Queen Pens, and I have an epidemiologist, Dr. Anne Ramoyne, and she's guiding us to anybody that's traveling must quarantine for 10 days. If they're coming from a plane, 10 to 14 days. And then once we say that, they're like, oh, I'll drive or whatever, so they kind of avoid the plane. We've had a lot of crew members who tried to fly, and we've said, it's not going to work. You're going to have to quarantine for 10 to 12, 14 days, and then they'll change their mind and say, okay, I'll drive down from San Francisco down to Los Angeles. It's just a tricky thing. And we require 2 tests prior to first employment. So if you have a grip that's going to be on our show, you have to get a 72-hour test, and then that has to be negative, and then we test that person again before we even let them start working with us. And we have found a couple positives this way through day players.
Yeah, right. And if you finding a positive and suggest it is, that it is out there, and even though folks were asymptomatic, they had it or could have spread it to other folks. So
yeah, the thing with the protocols as well, like different studios have different protocols with that as well, as far as employment, even before the September 21st. First of all, luckily my production, we only do in-lab PCRs, and so I was totally pushing away from the rapid test, because the sensitivity is it's just too much. It's a lot of shows that are shut down for short times had to do with a lot of false positives. And fingers crossed, the show that I was on from August that I just got off on, we've been going, I think probably since the second week in August, no positives. There were a couple quarantine situations that were short based on, some sick people at home, but no positives at all. And I think it's really important. People want to jump into the rapid situation, and they have to understand that the sensitivity is basically how accurate is the positive. And if it's 85%, then you have all of that room for people to, if every 250 tests you're going to have a positive, false positive, and you're testing 200 people like every 3 days. I mean, you end up shutting down a show that's millions of dollars for 14 days based off of a rapid test when the in-lab PCR is much more sensitive. That's the other thing too. People, the studios want to save money, but you spend a little extra money in the in-lab PCR, could possibly save yourself a lot of time from shutting down just over false positives.
Yeah, we had a positive last week on a crew member that was in contact with the directors who's been scouting, and then we tested that person again the next day, and it came up negative. So we are on schedule to test that person tomorrow morning again. He's quarantined right now. We went and tested his whole family that he was living with as a precaution. So it's rough,
I think there's an area where there's some gray here because yes, there is the possibility of false positives, but at the same time, if you start allowing people to test out of positives, you run the risk that they'll get false negatives and then they will have been positive. We were treating every positive as a positive. That was Netflix policy. But then encouraging and enforcing PPE standards that ideally, even if folks were positive, that other folks didn't shut down the entire production, for example, depending on who you had, right? I mean, who that positive is going to be. But I think that's one of those challenging areas about, can we trust the information we have as far as the testing? Ideally, we can. But then let's talk about PPE. So we were going KN95 respirator masks. Those are the ones that are not fitted for folks who are not aware. And then face shields as mandatory if you were going to be closer than 6 feet to people. And I'm guessing that's pretty much the standard across the industry, although you guys have experience in a wider range of productions. Is that what people are enforcing everywhere?
I don't know if it's everywhere, but on our show on Queen Pens, we are enforcing a KN95 mask with a face shield or safety glasses, really tight fitting safety glasses. We do surgical masks only if the person has a face shield on, and we don't let anybody be close to another within 6 feet. We don't eat together. We don't break for lunch together. We stay completely apart. We eat in our cars. So that way, when we did have a positive, we were able to contact trace and say, hey, that person was near the directors, but not anywhere 6 feet and never had the PP off.
Yeah, and that's what I tell people when I would train people doing my COVID training or via Zoom, is like I always refer back to being on the front line for 41 days when I was basically supervising multiple RNs, that none of my nurses ever tested positive for COVID, and we were working directly in COVID units. And I would explain that to say that PPE does make a difference. It will save you. Granted, we're on the film sets, we're not in this acute COVID care situation, but different shows have different requirements. Like we have facial options and we have safety glasses as well. We have 3 different masks that are available. Get into how the zone situation is, but everybody either wears a surgical mask or this cloth mask that's provided by the studio, but there's a filter you can place inside the mask. I always prefer to wear the surgical mask. Now, our people that are on set, which is our Zone A people, KN95 masks are required, because at the end of the day, like even if somebody gets quarantined, for me as a healthcare provider, like my main goal is trying to save your life. So where even if somebody tests positive around you and you're in contact with them, likely you won't end up in a hospital on a ventilator because you were still wearing appropriate PPE. You're just at home with no, you're not positive at all. You're just waiting till the quarantine's over. So, and it's hard to get that through to a lot of people that are not, that haven't worked in the healthcare industry, but, people are getting more adept to actually understanding what that is. And for me, I know that it's like my first idea when we were doing our test shoot was it's a lifesaver for me. And I think that's a great person as an advocate on set, which, I mean, for me, they're the general on set, but my first AD, Katie Carroll, was there. She was, we had a communication system where if something wasn't right, I'd send her a text or I'd send her right next to her and I'd say to her, and she would address that, and it is very important if your first AD is on board with everything, that's just so important. And I didn't have a problem with that. I was lucky to have that. So I don't know how other HSOs or COVID compliance officers are experiencing that on their sets with their first ADs, because sometimes you get on set and people just go rogue and they go back to what they were doing a year ago.
I really believe that the COVID compliance supervisor has to be somebody that understands production, because you have to be able to get in people's face and say, hey, you can't do that. And I hear of shows where there have people that don't have any on-set production experience and don't know how to talk to these people, that are just, the ADs are not listening to them, and they're just going and doing what they need to do to roll the cameras. When I say to somebody, hey, you need to put the first AC around the corners so that they're not in direct, anywhere close to the viral load, the actor takes the mask off, and I know how far you can pull focus around the corner. I know you can do it, so just do it. And if you had somebody that did not know film production, they'd be like, I don't know where you're supposed to be. Like, I saw a picture of a sound mixer this past week inside the set, within the airspace of where the actors were taking off a mask, and she didn't have a face shield on. So, it's just like, I think you really need people like myself who are ADs or medical people that have worked as medics on set to do these jobs.
Yeah, I think that's the future too. It's moving forward, is that the first ADs or second ADs are going to be in these supervisor positions when it comes to COVID compliance. And I think that's really going to be a benefit to the production and the director as well.
I think for it to work successfully, you really do need a collaboration between someone who can manage the logistics and understand the impact on set, but also that there is that medical expertise. On Red Notice, I had a traveling RN who'd been working in COVID wards. We're very lucky to find him, Liam Schmucker. He came on board, and then we worked together to figure out how these things are going to work on set. He didn't have any movie experience, but then by the benefit of my background and movie experience, we were able to design protocols and enforcement of protocols in a way that did not slow down filming, ideally. But I think the challenge is, as more and more productions ramp up and say, oh, we want to film as well, and there is no union around what this work is, I fear this is a race to the bottom as far as the folks doing the job. In other words, lots of folks are out of work. This is an opportunity to come back to work. How do we maintain the standards of expertise that does keep everybody safe on set?
I think that it's important to be training. I have a whole training presentation that I created for Queen Pins, the movie I'm currently on, and I have that available. So, it's just like, I really think that for the next year, there is a much bigger training class than just a COVID compliance officer training. I think it's much more detailed. You got to do budgets. You got to know the union rules. You got to read those new papers that came out, the return to work papers, and you have to know them almost like an attorney. It's really a UPM person or somebody that understands legal documents.
Well, you've both alluded to it. Let's be a little more specific. We talked about how there was originally the white paper and then the Safe Path Forward back in June. On September 21st, they did publish the COVID-19 Return to Work Safety Agreement, which covers productions that are under the basic agreement or the FLTTA. And this is an actual agreement between producers and unions about the minimum standards for testing and zone protocols and having these health and safety teams. That is the way forward, I think, right? As far as they're coming together in agreement and the actual standards that have to be met. It's only been another month. Are you guys seeing changes on set based on this new agreement, or is it largely just sort of encapsulate what we were doing already?
We're requiring our department heads to sign off, to physically say on an email that we've read the new paperwork and we knew the new guidelines. So we're actually requiring them to sign off that they agree to those terms.
That's a good idea. Part of the thing that I was running into even before that is that when it came to anything COVID related, a lot of the departments were hands off, that they didn't want to take any, like I had certain departments that didn't want to, I created this checklist that, that they would have to check off on about whether they had any PPE needs or certain things that were going on, or how was the pod structure, things like that. And I had some departments that didn't even want to sign off on that because their union said they didn't have to sign off on it. I was like, well, everybody, you're the department head. You have to take some responsibility of making sure your people are informed. So that was something that I ran into even before that came out on the 21st. And after that came out on the 21st, I still had situations where if it was COVID related, nobody wanted anything to do with it. That's the COVID team to deal with it. And that was just how it was going on my production, and I think it still is to an extent.
Yeah, I send emails to people saying, hey, I want you to use this product to disinfect your props or your wardrobe, and then I get no response back. So I just think that they're not taking the responsibility to understand what they need to do. And then, so I just bought the product. I'm going to give it to them and show them how to use it. And hopefully that'll become a regular piece of business for them.
And that's the thing too, Jill. Like I would have, the people not want to respond to work, but as soon as something came up where they were concerned about their health or anything else, or they were immediately trying to come back to you and either put something on you or inquire about things as to basically why we weren't doing something. But that's why, like with our production, we have used two different products that were approved that everybody's using for cleaning their equipment and stuff like that as well. That was, I didn't really want to give people the option.
All right, so I'm going to start using Maxcy's HP disinfectant, and it's a 1 minute contact time. It's basically hydrogen peroxide kind of base, and I'm going to be using an atomizer gun or fogging machine, starting on queen pins. It's basically like the fogging that the big fogging companies use, but we're going to use a similar, looks like a Dirty Harry gun, and it sprays using a UV light as well, and it's EPA approved, so we'll see how that goes.
But yeah, we have electrostatic sprayers, some people that are spraying high touch surfaces and everything as well. And so some of the departments, set deck and props and wardrobe, they really like to use like the EMIST, these electrostatic sprayer guns, and then there's a little backpack unit as well.
Yeah, I'm planning on giving the backpack system to transportation so they could do the honey wagon and the bathrooms in the cast trailers. And they're just like, whatever product, give it to us, we'll do it. So that's great.
You guys talk about having challenges on set, and I think there is a tendency to default to your old way of doing business under the pressure of getting filming done. But my experience on Red Notice, though, is that largely the crew was very much on board with wanting to work and wanting to do it safely. And yeah, there is an issue of like, well, is that health and safety budget, to buy, PPE or the things we do? Or if you wanted to buy a gun specifically to work on equipment in your department, that sounds like a COVID department expense, or specialized face shields, or, things that are above and beyond. And there'd be some discussion about that, how things are budgeted, but our folks largely were glad to be there and working and recognize the need, not just to keep themselves from getting sick, but to presume that they're sick and protect others as well. Because when it boils down to it, to film with actors without masks, you have to create a space where you can minimize the chance that they're going to catch it, not only because they're most vulnerable with not wearing PPE at the time, but you lose your actors, obviously, then nobody's working if your actor goes into quarantine, much less gets sick.
The thing with some of the departments are different. Now, when you're dealing with construction, that can be a different group of people than you're dealing with when it comes to wardrobe. And on the productions that I've worked on, the people that are most diligent and asking a lot of questions or have a lot of concerns are wardrobe. They're the first ones that are, coming to me, asking me different things, or have, and they come out initially as people like to call them, thinking they're going to be the troublemakers, or they're going to get on your nerves. And they turned out to be my favorite department because they were constantly ahead of the game of like, well, what are we going to do about this when we do background thing? And that's part of the thing with COVID, is that you have to plan ahead. And that's means different things for different departments. And people didn't really understand what that actually meant until something happened. I was like, no, we can't do this. You have to plan. But the different departments, they have different personalities, and some people are much more on to doing things right, and some say they want to do things right. And then those are the people you see constantly pulling their masks down and being non-compliant.
Well, let's talk some more about the protocols that have been solidified by the agreement now. So it set up standards for testing. It also set up these health and safety teams, or actual teams. They're allowed to be ADs. That's new. There was concern in the beginning, I know in the early discussions, that this responsibility would be added to existing AD teams and just been more work, which I think, as any of us can testify, there's too much work here to also be doing any kind of filming work at all. I mean, to stay focused on COVID protocols, you cannot have other responsibilities. It's good to understand what's happening on set, but you can't have responsibilities for actually executing that. So it establishes that we have separate teams, and then also establishes zones. And this is an area where I think it's interesting that, like, Netflix has their own zone system, red, yellow, green, but then the zones with letters or zones with numbers, people, those couple of months gaps, particularly these larger studios, have moved in different directions about what the zones mean. And sometimes you have to translate, and even how those zones are applied in practice. I think there's a general principle that's captured, but it can be a little different set to set.
Yeah, I just followed the paperwork from the guidelines. My sets say on my paperwork and my training slides, they say A, B, C, and D. And then they say, but A is in red, B is in yellow, and C is in green, and then D is purple or whatever. So I just incorporated their language, but then I followed the Netflix design, which I think is great. Red, yellow, green. That makes sense to everybody.
In our production, we initially, with the Safe Way Forward, we were doing, Zone A and Zone B, and Zone C was considered, when you're at home doing anything, or not at the studio. And then when they came out C and D, the way our production worked, like, most of our people are still Zone A and Zone B. The Zone C people, shoppers and stuff that may not, and I would just, on the err on the side of caution, anybody that, if you're interacting with anybody in Zone B, there's no, especially on a daily basis in our building, they're not Zone C. But so most of our people are Zone A and Zone B. For us, Zone A was red and Zone B was blue at the beginning. It's actually still that way right now. If that's, if that changes, that changes. But that's basically how we're focusing on our production. Zone A and Zone B are the main situation. There's not many people that are even in our Zone C. The people that are in our building, like facility people at the studio, they're getting tested as well. We have them been tested, but there's multiple productions in the whole actual studio. So the good thing to do is that, for, like, I spoke with the HSO on that to see kind of what their protocols were, and we kind of collaborated and figure out what's going on both of our sets, and figure out, what's, because, you have sometimes your crew is kind of, you don't want them mingling with that crew, or people coming into your area, and people have become very protective of their area they're working in, and they see people without a wristband on, not wearing a mask. They're like, what are you doing here? You're not supposed to be here, which is, great.
Well, it's helpful if everybody is paying attention to the protocols, rather than having just 2 or 3 people or 10 people or even 100 people who are trying to police it. I don't think it's possible to police it in full. We really have to have, everyone's got to be on board with what the standards are.
Yeah, we have maps that are being made by the location department, and I approve those maps. And we designate where the A zone is. We cone it off, and they have their own bathrooms, and that way we funnel the crew, the A zone crew, and the actors into those bathrooms, and then we're going to position a PA right to can monitor that, and not, and lock it off with like chain, like orange chain that goes from cone to cone. And then on the maps, when we're planning and we have our logistics meetings with the assistant directors, we're going over those zones. It's very, very clear. And then for me, the C zone is a place to take your mask off. It's 30 yards from the set, away, way, way from the red zone. I've seen maps from New Mexico that had the C right next to the A. I'm like, guys, that's not going to work. We got to keep these people clear. Another cool thing that I saw out of New Mexico is for catering during lunchtime, like the old-fashioned TV trays that used to sit with and watch TV. We're taking those little TV trays, putting those outside, and putting umbrellas over the top of those, and then coordinating off the lunch area so that no one's inside, and that everybody has their own little umbrella to sit under. They get their food and they sit at their little table, and then the COVID team comes in, cleans those, and then the next group of people comes in.
That's a good, that's part of our problem too. Like, how if we're on a sound stage, like, we don't have a lot of space compared to do a lot of those things. And so we've been kind of struggling to kind of make things work out, even with the lunch situation and putting a tent out in, New York, where we were subject to weather and snow and different things like that. So that's kind of the challenge as well, because I wanted to have separate bathrooms for Zone A, but you're in the studio, there's only a set of bathrooms in the hallway, you have bathrooms upstairs, and then you have the bathrooms inside the shops. And so it was very difficult to, to kind of separate these zone bathrooms, versus like, okay, let's bring in these bathroom trailers. So that's been a struggle for, like, people that are on these sound stages, and some of these sound stages aren't really designed well. You go into them, you're like, well, I don't understand how they thought this was a good idea, but Anyway,
Even before COVID.
Are you guys
It
using
was-
air scrubbers? Are you
yeah,
using air scrub?
yeah, we have a lot of the HEPA filters. Yeah, and they're bringing 25% outside air for our HVAC system. Yeah.
Okay, good.
we should talk a little bit more about the zones because I'm not sure we
Yeah,
made
it's
it
a
clear,
struggle.
but the idea with zone A or the red zone as Netflix called it, or zone 1 for whatever studio's using that, basically where there's the highest risk. And it's a guidance for what level of PPE has to be worn by folks there. And the idea that masks and face shields to prevent back and forth. But the thing is, on a film set, people are always getting closer together and always sort of crowding on the space or trying to get many things done at once. So it's a really challenge to maintain social distance standards. And even, like you say, the PPE standards, people aren't accustomed to it for doing that for long periods of time in that space.
Deal with it.
Yeah, but again, people get distracted. And if we can set up these teams, and that's another thing that was in the agreement, that these teams are established separately to be there to remind folks about what's in their best interest as a reminder, again, rather than trying to catch people or, turn it into who's violating what. It is possible to work under those conditions. And then again, trying to create safe spaces where people can eat. We're used to socializing and eating all the time. And just the idea of separating those activities, that they're not happening simultaneously, because that's where your big risk of cross infection is. That was a real mental shift for people, particularly on film sets.
Yeah, I think the key is training. It's like I have a video of a 3D video that goes, and I show them, and I say, this is the most important video you're going to see. And it shows how a cough, goes in a room for 10 minutes. So there was a DP that I was working with on a commercial a couple of weeks ago, and he put on goggles. And I said to him, I think I showed him the video, and this is something that I didn't get to train beforehand. And he's like, oh, okay, got it. And he put on the goggles. And I think it's the training, just like the Greg's medical staff before, we didn't have any idea about infectious disease. And now we're learning, from our experts that are teaching us how to deal with this and protect ourselves. There's no way is anybody on my set not going to wear a goggle or a face shield or glasses within proximity for 10 minutes with the actor having the mask off. Even though they've been tested, we can't guarantee that they don't have COVID.
That's right. You basically have to assume that everybody has it all the time. It's just asymptomatic, and then, act accordingly. We also had a training program on our film where all crew was trained before coming in on PPE and the zones and how we were working things. But then you run into, like what Greg brought up earlier, is it trying to rush to get people on, or want to test them out of cycle, or can we test them now using this test so they can start next week? We really need them in. That's a real challenge. And without pre-planning, it becomes very difficult. That was the other thing I don't know on the production you guys have been on, but I had an entire office staff dedicated to just tracking testing and traveling and scheduling and just all of that. I think my office was larger than a lot of major film production offices. Let's say I had 6 people in the office that were all dedicated to COVID, and all of them were off-site. Like none of them were actually doing on-site work, but just to track the massive amounts of who get tested and tested when and what you do with a positive or quarantine. It was an enormous undertaking, to say the least.
Yeah, I would say you need somebody who is two. I think you need 2 people doing the testing coordination, or 3, because I have one person doing it right now on the film we're on, and it's too much. She's working 7 days a stretch, and so we're going to get her some help. But I feel like it should be somebody like a POC or somebody that understands how to track people and crew members, and actually what they do for a living is really, really important.
That was one of the struggles too of getting on and trying to build our team, is that people didn't understand how much of an undertaking the testing situation is. And initially when I went on, it was me, and I had an HSM under me, and we were doing everything to start. And that testing situation, people will call and try to have things scheduled the day before. And I was like, they were thinking we're available 24 hours a day. And, now after starting in August and up until now they just said, okay, we want to give you guys a PA to assist with your testing admin. Oh, okay. Well, because initially they were like, okay, you have one of the biggest teams in the country, where there was, I think, 9 of us. And now it was explained like, okay, well, now we've been talking to some of our people, and you guys have one of the smaller teams here, especially in New York. It's like, well, Okay. Either way, like that's the thing of not understanding the production, not understanding how much things actually take, and understanding how much of an undertaking the whole COVID situation is.
Yeah, it's a learning experience for sure. And then you go into productions and they're like, oh, you don't need that many people. And I think we just have to put our foot down and say, this is what we require. If you want us to do this job, we require this many people to do two to three people managing the testing. Because you could be testing 300 to 500 people, depending on where you are. And I hear nightmare stories of people quitting all the time in these roles. I understand. It's like, I would say it's equated to like a football coach or a manager of a football team where you have hundreds of people coming in and out and quarantining and isolating. It's just a lot.
Yeah, our team on Red Notice, I think we had 60 full-time folks. We had a whole additional staff of rotating people that were handling our temperature checks and paramedics to do that at a gate, maintain our zone area. If there was any challenge, it was the construction scheduling was very, very much on top of the filming scheduling, and trying to maintain different zones for different people and keep everyone safe at the same time. We were also running a sequester where our red zone folks were all in hotels we had bought out, and we're only traveling back and forth to set. And so trying to maintain those zones both on the lot and then separate from the lot. And so quite a bit of that. And that didn't include our vendors, our decon vendors, or our some of our hygiene vendors. That was on top of that as well, as far as the team of what we were putting together. But that brings up a big challenge. Like, Netflix has a lot of money and is invested in this movie and can afford to say, okay, let's try it like this. But in some ways we were the victims of our own success, because as we started to film, as more and more productions stood up, the PAs we were training to be monitors, they would go because they wanted to do PA work, which is actually what they're doing in the business. Like, in the beginning, when there weren't a lot of folks, we could find the staff, but then once shows started ramping up, it got harder and harder to find folks that wanted to commit to this work, because it was a grind, to your point, Jill, and people were quitting all the time.
I'm trying to assemble about 20 people because I know they're not going to want to work and do this job. They're going to want to do other PA work, and it's a dirty job. You got to go in, clean high touch areas. You got to go clean prep and wherever the company's moving to next. You have to clean the bathrooms.
Yeah, and that was part of my thing too, because I had a couple of people, like I had two PAs that moved on to something else, and it was a question from production one time, well, why are these people leaving? I'm like, you guys do understand, like, I have a PA here who has a degree in film. You think they're going to want to scrub toilets for the rest of, like, people, and my idea was like, I want to get a bunch of like part-time PAs in here so there's not this constant turnover. And it still wasn't understanding, like, this is normal. These people are not going to want, these are college graduates with these degrees that want to focus in film or do other things. They're not going to do certain things forever, like especially cleaning toilets. They're not going to do this, especially stuff starts ramping up. They're going to move on. And you have to plan ahead for that. Understand that this is how this is going to work. Unless you find somebody that's been pushing a mop or broom for 10 to 15 years and that's what they want to do, great. But that's just not what's happening here.
Well, we might have split between the monitoring work, which was, making sure folks are using their masks and maintaining social distancing and sort of running the teams and running our gate checks and things like that, versus my hygiene team, who I went through a vendor for that. And so he was finding folks that had sanitation experience or cleaning experience, because trying to ramp up PAs and get them to stay, to your point, Greg, these, all filmmakers in training was difficult. But by finding a vendor, Clean Set company down in Atlanta provided us the folks that we needed and, maintain that group. Now, in general, finding folks who do that work and then are just ramping up to add the extra protocols around COVID, I thought was easier than training production assistants from scratch. Although, Jill, maybe if you find the right group of folks, maybe you'll have more success with that.
And Jill, it's when you mentioned that we actually work using, there's a company I work with called Micron Disinfection, and they were consulting or having people, because I was like, I need people that are janitors to do these things, and they were getting people from Saniset actually. They were sending us some people, and then it was like, these people that were coming in these field rep positions were not expected to be janitors. It's like, this isn't what they were understanding was going to happen. So
I think we have to be clear about what the job is and how, I always say it's a dirty job when I hire people.
Absolutely.
So how long is this going to last, guys? What are we looking at for, it's as, how long is the industry going to work under these conditions? Just throwing it out there.
What's your epidemiologist saying, Jill?
What's my epidemiologist?
Yeah, what's she
Yeah,
saying?
she's saying like mid-April, small batches of vaccines going to
Yeah.
high level people who are very sick, or the medical field getting vaccine first. It's not looking good. So, what do you think?
I think it's gonna. I mean, I'd say a year at least. Like, I mean, next August, September, maybe something. But I mean, even when the vaccines come out, a lot of people are not going to want to take the vaccines, and they're just not going to do it. And that's the problem with, there's also a lot of people that I was hiring on my team were theater people, these theater stage managers that were out of work, which is also kind of a good option sometimes. Well, theater's not coming back really until there's a vaccine. And, people have to be willing to take the vaccine. So I don't know where the end is until you get people compliant with taking the vaccine. And I don't know, is this going to be like a flu situation where people have to take the vaccine every year? Because there's been some, the issue with the reinfection situation and questioning whether people are able to fully build antibodies, and if those antibodies are only appropriate with, what that strain is. It's just unknown. I don't know. I know. I don't know.
Well,
Especially.
I do want to say though, I don't think things are hopeless. And when this first started back in March, when things were shutting down and we were still learning more and more about COVID-19, I would have said that it wasn't possible to film at all. That there's no way that under the conditions we require to do filming, that you're going to be able to have safety protocols that keep people safe. But I got to say that, with the sort of research and the expertise, Netflix, to their credit, did a great job of putting together a panel of medical experts and really thinking this stuff through. I do think it's possible. And in the end, I think we were comfortable with the filming we were doing on Red Notice. And in fact, you were a lot safer on set with us than you probably were out in real life elsewhere in Atlanta, Georgia, for sure. So I think that there's progress on that.
Yeah, I definitely think there's progress, and I definitely think that there's hope. And I also tell people, it was like, if you guys are following the protocols now, like, because people are concerned about, because I have different information about COVID, and there's this really good poster that I have up in many places throughout the studio, where you have the signs and symptoms of COVID, then you have COVID versus the flu, then you have the cold versus allergies and different things. Is that when you get into flu season and those lines get blurred and people are not sure what this is or what's going on, it's like, if you're following these guidelines, you should also are less likely to get the flu if you're wearing your mask and you're doing hand hygiene, and so you should be in a safer situation. But when people they get in these safe places, and then they let their guard down, they're like, oh, they get a little lax, and they just start falling back into the pre-COVID norms.
Yeah, and I always tell people, have you gotten a cold in the last 6 months? And they're like, no. It's because you've been wearing a mask.
Right.
Right.
I like that, Jill. We're in a war.
Yeah.
It is. I feel that way because I'm so passionate about people's health and being safe, and people just, people got jaded with the whole quarantine and doing it, and they want to stop and go out and live their lives. I'm like, well, you can live your life, but I always tell people in the trainings, like, I'm looking out for the person who's most at risk. You have no idea that the person next to you may have stage 2 cancer, or they're going home to an elderly parent or a sick child, or they have some immune problem, and you're doing things breaking the rules, and they're laughing and smiling with you, but they're terrified, and they're coming to me, talking to me about these things. So it's like, if I'm taking care of the person that I know that is most at risk, then I know I'm doing the best I can with that situation. Because unlike, other shows, like for this show that I'm on, me being an independent provider here in the state of New York, people will come to me asking me different things about diagnosis and what do you think about this? And I can give them advice on that. And it's just really important for people to have that culture of vigilance, of being responsible for themselves and understanding that their actions affect the person next to them.
What's next for you guys then?
Well, I'm starting to go on auditions here, and
things are ramping back up.
Let's come back to
work. Things are ramping back up. I love healthcare and I love, nutrition and things like that. But I mean, being an actor is my passion, and it was the first time that both of those mediums met, healthcare and entertainment. But I want to be in front of the camera. That's kind of where that's why I'm here. So I'm in New York. So
Yeah, and then I was on track to become a director. I was already directing as an AD. I was moving into directing, and you can see my credits. I was like slowly getting there, and then this happened. I had to take a step back. I'm currently on Queen Pins, and we'll see how that goes.
well, I mean,
Jill-
you're going to be totally amped up, Jill, for when you're director and you have all that stuff under you as well. You can run the whole set.
I can be like, get your PP on, back to one.
Right.
Get the scrubbers in here now.
Right.
Get the guns.
That's the other thing too, of like the directors that are, there's some directors that are not willing to kind of do the right thing. And luckily I know the director I was working on this show, he was very, I don't know if I can reveal that name, Robert, no, that's appropriate, but I mean, he was very specific about doing the right thing. And I told him initially, I said, if I'm coming on, it hasn't come from the top. If the people in the top are not doing the right thing, then everybody else are gonna do whatever they want. And he was very specific about wanting to follow the rules. And when we were on set, he was like, Greg, am I good? I'm okay. I was like, you're fine. But the one thing on set is that DP and the director, that you have to keep them apart, because he's constantly wanting to look over and, put that plexiglass right there, like you got to stay over here. And people don't want to speak up for themselves sometimes. And I get it, because they're a little, depending on who they're working with, they don't keep telling people like, you got to stay over there. So, I definitely plexi off the DP and the director from everyone to kind of stop them from breaking away.
Yeah, I don't have that. I just have them on, I'm going to put them in comms, like the crane operator comms, the headphones, and so they can communicate and there's no getting close to each other.
Well, good luck with that, Jill. Jill, if people want to visit your compliance services, where do they go? Where do they look that up?
No, it's going to be COVID-19complianceservices.com.
Okay. And again, I think you'll have a lot of work at least through the start of next year. We'll see how long it goes. Guys, both of you, thank you very much for coming on today. We'll check back in with you.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Listeners, I can't say it often enough. Your feedback is always welcome and greatly appreciated. You can send your email comments to skid, S-K-I-D, at belowtheline1word.biz. That's B-I-Z. Please rate us wherever you get your podcast. It helps us reach new listeners. And new listeners, most of our material is evergreen, so feel free to peruse our past seasons. Maybe another episode will catch your eye. If you're on Facebook, you can find photos and other behind-the-scenes materials at Podcast Below the Line. And finally, you can follow the podcast on Twitter and Instagram. It's at Pod Below the Line. Thanks to Curtis Five for our music and John Wan for our logo. The logo is available on t-shirts, mugs, and stickers at redbubble.com. It's good to be back, and we've got a nice slate of episodes to round out season 6. Be safe out there.